The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this presentation titled 2022 State of the Commonwealth, which is being hosted by me, Brian Rio, Marketing and Event Coordinator at REMI, and Peter Evangelakis, Senior Vice President of Economics and Consulting at REMI. At REMI, we provide economic modeling software for topics related to transportation, equity, environment, economic development, and more that helps inform policies impacting day-to-day lives. The presenters of this webinar are Bob McNabb and James Cook from the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy at Old Dominion University. We're very happy to have worked with them to make this webinar come together. At any time during this presentation, you can ask a question in the question box, and at the end, Peter will moderate these questions with our presenters, as long as time permits. Also, shortly after this presentation, a copy of the slides, a report, and a recording of this webinar will be sent to your emails for your reference. Peter, go ahead and introduce our speakers further.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome two of our speakers today. And actually, for the third year, we're hosting the Dragas Center in doing a webinar of their State of the Commonwealth. So we're very proud to have partnered with them and have worked with them in the past as well. I'd like to introduce both of our speakers today. First, we have Professor Robert McNabb, who currently serves as the chair of the Department of Economics and the director of the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy, and in the Strome College of Business at Old Dominion University. He is a member of the Joint Advisory Board of Economists for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Survey of Professional Forecasters, and is an associate editor with the Journal of Economic Survey. Professor McNabb has been published in Applied Economics, Cornell Hospitality Quarterly, Defense and Peace Economics, National Tax Journal, Public Budgeting and Finance, and World Development, among others. He edits the annual State of the Region, Hampton Roads, and State of the Commonwealth reports. And Professor McNabb has appeared in the Associated Press, China Global Television Network, CNN, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Yahoo News, and Yahoo Finance, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Virginian Pilot, and the Daily Press, among others. Dr. McNabb joined the faculty of the Department of Economics in the Strome College of Business of Old Dominion University in July of 2016, and was previously a member of the faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California from 2000 to 2016. And our second speaker today will be James Cook, who is a Board of Visitors, professor of Economics Emeritus, and President Emeritus at Old Dominion University. Prior to becoming the president of Old Dominion, he served as president of University of Montana, and he was selected as one of the 100 most effective college presidents in the United States. Dr. Cook is an economist, and a portion of his recent published economic research is focused on college costs and affordability, and the special roles that historically Black colleges and universities occupy in American higher education. This work has appeared in books published by the Brookings Institution, the Johns Hopkins University Press, and the Columbia University Press. But he is with us today because of his research concerning the incomes earned by America's lawyers. In short, and in contrast to what many individuals believe to be the case, he shows that the real price-adjusted median income of a lawyer in the United States has declined since 2000, but we will let him tell that story. With that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. McNabb to begin.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, REMI, for hosting us today. This is a unique privilege to come in front of REMI and our audience to discuss our work on the State of the Commonwealth report. And of course, our work is informed and the data is often publicly available, but our forecasts and commentary are always our own and do not represent the views of the Commonwealth, the president of Old Dominion University, the Board of Visitors, the Strome College of Business, or our donors. If you have any questions or comments or wish to engage in discussion, we are more than happy to do so. and we look forward to the conversation. The way we have structured the presentation today is I will essentially set the scene for the economy of the United States and Virginia, focusing more on Virginia and its prospects for growth in 2023 and beyond. And of course, Dr. Cook will come and speak about a much more interesting topic, and that is the fate of lawyers. And so let's begin. And if we're going to begin, we have to think about the macroeconomy in the United States. And again, everything is going to be framed in 2023 and beyond by the shock that occurred in the spring of 2020. As you could see from the graph that we have here on the screen, the shock in terms of the contraction of measured economic output as measured by real gross domestic product was historic in terms of its magnitude and its speed. And as the recovery occurred, it again was one that is historic in terms of not only its size, but its speed at which it happened. And so we often yearn to return back to the previous decade where growth was reasonably predictable and within a fairly tight range. And what we've seen is an injection of volatility as of the COVID-19 pandemic played out in the United States and the imposition of restrictions on social and business activity. And as those relaxed, we saw a return to one might say normal levels of economic activity, but still we are seeing increased volatility relative to the pre-COVID era. And so if we think about this and we place ourselves in the context of economists in the spring of 2020, and especially those forecasting revenues for state and local governments, we were looking into an abyss. We essentially saw this massive contraction of economic activity due to closures of gyms and restaurants and movie theaters, a dramatic fall in airline travel and hotel travel, not to mention the international constraints on travel and logistics and supply chain shocks. And this led to many state and local governments who are in the midst of their budget cycle when the pandemic hit to make very conservative forecasts for the coming fiscal year. And what we saw was an immediate dip in retail sales, but then consumers rebounded unexpectedly. And I don't think the majority of economists would have said that prior to the pandemic, we could have a massive shock to the national economy and the consumers would recover with that shock in 2 quarters and then spend even more than they did prior to that shock. And we saw consumers were exceptionally resilient in their spending, some of that because of it was deferred consumption from other activities that they could no longer engage in, but it also shows that consumers have been willing to spend. And even in the face of inflation, we saw that retail sales continued to increase. Of course, we did see in the most recent data a downturn in retail sales, but then, of course, the latest month that just came in showed a rebound. And of course, underlying this is the specter of inflation. And we hear many people still suffer from recency bias relative to the current position in the previous decade. That is, we all somewhat grew accustomed to the relatively stable rates of inflation and core inflation in the 2010s. And so in our perspective, when inflation increased significantly relative to that baseline, for example, to 6, 7, 8, and topping out at 9% with regards to the consumer price index, year-over-year change, it was dramatic in terms of our expectations. And what we've seen, however, in the most recent data is that the consumer price index year-over-year change, or monthly inflation, has come off its peak, and core inflation, however, still remains relatively persistent and clocked in at roughly 5.5%. And so we need to think about inflation and inflationary expectations more in line with perhaps the late 1970s than we should think about them in the aftermath of the Great Recession and the recovery of the Great Recession in the 2010s. But inflation is not solely a U.S. phenomenon. And if we look at the sources of inflation, this highlights how supply chain shocks globally came through the United States. And so if we look at the red line here, which is durable goods, we can see the first manifestation of inflation in terms of price increases were in durable goods, if we ignore, of course, the real estate market. And that topped out at almost 17, 18, 19% in the year-over-year change. However, we've seen durable goods come off their peak prices, and prices are actually declining relative to in the latest data relative to the same point in the previous year. Then, of course, we see non-durables increase, and then non-durables have come off their peaks. However, services continue to be on an upward trend. That is concerning because of the breadth and depth of services in the U.S. economy. And so that suggests that we've seen inflation and inflationary expectations become somewhat baked in the broader economy. It's no longer associated merely with supply chain shocks and geopolitical shocks that are transiting through the economy in a temporary fashion, but that we're starting to see price adjustments that are becoming essentially locked in, and expectations of future price adjustments are occurring and becoming locked in as well. As I mentioned, globally, this is not just solely a U.S. phenomenon. In the most recent data available, monthly inflation in Australia, as you could see, and in the most significant line was 12.6%. Germany is slightly off its peak, is 8.6%, and the United States 6.3% relative to Japan, which has seen inflation increase after a sustained period of almost no inflation, if not deflation, to 2.4%. And perhaps that is why there's a difference in monetary policy between the United States and Japan, because Japan is seeing price growth more in line with its central bank targets relative to other countries, which are seeing excessive increases in inflation relative to their targets. For example, the United States, the Federal Reserve typically targets 2% average inflation in the personal consumption index. We're well above that now. And so that means that the Federal Reserve is likely to continue tightening monetary policy in terms of the discount rate and the money supply in the coming quarters. In terms of inflationary expectations, inflation is one of those phenomenons that we tend to argue that as people observe inflation and see inflation impact their pocketbooks, so to speak, they tend to form expectations of continued inflation in the future. And if we compare the most recent data from the BLS and the University of Michigan Consumer Survey, we see that forward-looking inflationary expectations coming out of this survey remain at 4.4%. And one might argue this is above where the Fed would like it to be. And so the data suggests that the economy continues to undergo price pressures, and the Federal Reserve will continue to respond to those price pressures by increasing the discount rate and tightening other measures of monetary policy. If we then put this together and look at the yield curve, and if you remember, the yield curve is essentially the difference between the 10 and the 2-year constant maturity rates for U.S. Treasuries, you can see that we have now entered an area which is a signal of an impending recession. And so with the yield curve being negative, investors are increasingly bearish on short-term conditions. And so this suggests that investors are looking forward in the short term, and markets are responding and pricing in a significant slowdown in economic activity, if not an outright recession. While many people actually focus on the discount rate as a measure of monetary policy, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, did we essentially create some of this inflationary phenomenon ourselves? And one way to look at this is the real money stock. And here M2 is a measure of the money supply that includes cash and checking deposits and easily convertible, what's called near money. That is money that can become liquid in a short period of time. And one way to gain a perspective on the stimulus associated from the monetary policy side of the house with regards to COVID-19 is to examine the response to the Great Recession and then examine the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you observe the slide and you see the money stock highlighted at 3.5 trillion prior to the Great Recession, you see a relatively small bump increase. That is an increase in the money supply in terms of a monetary response due to the downturn in economic activity. However, if we look at the historical evolution of the money supply, we see the money supply has increased over time, but has remained during period times relatively flat. In fact, if you look during the 1990s, the overall real money stock in the United States did not change considerably at all. After the Great Recession, however, the Federal Reserve engaged in quantitative easing, and the quantitative easing is essentially another word for money creation. And by engaging in money creation, the Federal Reserve was trying to meet its dual mission of relatively low inflation and improving employment. And since the underlying rate of inflation was relatively stable and at or below the Fed's target, the Fed felt that it could engage in essential money creation to boost economic activity. And so that's why you see the money stock continue to increase, even though the United States was in the midst of its longest peacetime expansion in its recorded history. And then you see prior to the onset of COVID-19 that the real money stock was estimated to be approximately 5.96 or $6 trillion. And then you see the monetary response, the hockey stick, essentially in terms of increasing the amount of cash available in the United States economy. And then you see, of course, a downturn from that. But relative to where we started, the size of the money supply is still larger than it was. And so basic economics would suggest that if you throw more money into the economy and you couple that with supply chain shocks, it should be no surprise that average prices tend to increase. Well, another way to look at this is to look at the cyclicality of the growth in the money supply and inflation. And one might argue we have actually returned perhaps to the 1970s, where we see the red lines increases in the money supply followed subsequently by increases in monthly inflation as measured by the year-over-year change in the consumer price index. And we could see sort of this increase in the money supply followed by an increase in inflation, then an ebb in the money supply followed by a decrease in inflation. This becomes somewhat more noisy, of course, in the aftermath of the Great Recession. But if one wanted to gain perspective on the size of the monetary response to the COVID-19 pandemic, one only needs to look at the highlighted figure in the spring of where this money supply shows the year-over-year increase in the real money stock in the United States was approximately 25%. In 1 year. So if you increase the money stock in the United States by a quarter in 12 months, you should not be surprised that that contributes to inflation. Of course, what we're seeing now, however, is that the Federal Reserve is allowing obligations to expire. It's allowing those securities and other types of holdings to expire. As they expire, it's bringing money outside the economy. And so relative to the peak, we're starting to see the real money supply in the United States start to drop as the Federal Reserve attempts to unwind its liabilities. And so this suggests, if we start looking forward, we might see a deceleration in inflation. Another way to think about this is compare the year-over-year inflation measure that we usually do with the 6-month moving average, a monthly annualized inflation. So instead of looking over the year-over-year change, we look at the blue line looks over the month-over-month change and looks at the 6-month moving average of that. And that essentially allows us to look a little bit ahead in terms of the inflation measure, because remember, inflation is a lagging indicator because it's the year-over-year change relative to 12 months ago. And this gives us a little bit more insight about the evolution of contemporaneous inflation, which is the month-over-month change. Month-over-month change, of course, is more volatile. That's why we take a 6-month moving average, and we can see that the 6-month moving average is below the year-over-year monthly inflation rate, which suggests that we may see continued deceleration of inflation in the coming months. And so in terms of the resiliency of the U.S. economy, one of the things that people have expected is that labor markets would slow in the face of rising interest rates and tighter monetary policy. We've seen a shock to labor markets, especially with regards to employment here measured in the right line, where you see that approximately 25 million people reported that they were out of work or reduced working hours in a very short period of time in the spring of 2020. But if we compare the level of the blue line in the most latest data with the level prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, you could see the number of people, the red line, that are reporting that they are employed relative to the pre-COVID levels is above. And we see that the size of the labor force is actually larger also at the national level. That's actually going to be an interesting point of comparison when we get to Virginia. Now, when we look at unemployment rates by race, we could see that we've come off the peaks observed during the spring shock of 2020, and we've actually seen unemployment rates continue to trend downward. In the latest data, we had a historically low unemployment rate, I believe, in the last 4 decades. This suggests that labor markets are increasingly constrained, and they're increasingly constrained for a variety of reasons we'll touch upon shortly. So if we look at the number of jobs in the United States, what we're seeing is that employers continue to hire. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, there were 152.4 million reported jobs in the United States. At the trough of the pandemic, that had been reduced to 130.4 million. In the December data, that was reported at 154.5 million. So more jobs than existed prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that suggests nationally labor markets have largely recovered. In fact, if we start looking at the employment population ratio and we compare the employment population ratio in the current economic shock relative to previous recessions, an interesting story emerges. The black line measures the recovery of the employment population ratio for workers aged 25 to 54 in the 1990 recession. And you can see, we see that employment to population ratio dip and then recover back to the previous recession levels around the 15-month. In the 2001 recession, we see that dip and never recover before the onset of the 2007-2009 recession. In 2007 to 2009 recession, we see this long grinding recovery with regards to the employment population ratio. That is, it took approximately 135 months for the employment population ratio to return to pre-recessionary levels. Now, with regards to the COVID-19 recession, albeit short-lived recession, we see the employment population ratio dipped dramatically and also recovered quite swiftly. It is not fully recovered to where it was prior to the onset of the pandemic, but it has recovered more quickly relative to the Great Recession of 2007-2009. Of course, has recovered more completely than the 2001 recession. The question is, will this recovery continue, or will some people remain outside the labor force? So, of course, this creates a challenge for employers. We have employers still signaling a willingness to hire. So one of the easiest signals of demand is job openings, and the easier signal of existing supply is job quits. And so you see a mismatch, continued mismatch between job openings and job quits in the December data, with 11 million job openings, about 4 million job quits. And so this suggests that employers, even though you hear headlines of large employers like Apple, to a lesser extent, but Google and Facebook and so forth, laying off tech employees, you see a broad swath of employers across the United States still signaling that they wish to hire, and they can't find the right employees with the right skill at the right time. This, of course, means that in terms of negotiating power, we still see workers having significantly more power, I would argue, than they did during prior to the pandemic. So what's the situation in Virginia? Well, in Virginia, we see that Virginia sort of had a lost decade prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. You see Virginia starts to recover in 2010, and then it kind of wavers back and forth in terms of growth and not growth. Part of this is due to Virginia's dependence on federal spending. The Budget Control Act of 2011 and subsequent amendments meant that there were limits on discretionary spending. We had actual sequestration in fiscal year 2013. That, of course, significantly affected where we are in Hampton Roads around Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and of course, also limited economic activity in Northern Virginia. Virginia started to pick up steam in the latter half of the decade, and we see the shock in Virginia as measured by the contraction of real GDP was less than the United States, and the recovery was less. And we see Virginia contract much like the United States in the first 2 quarters of the last year, and then it's observed growth. And not only in the third quarter, but we estimate there was growth in the last quarter as well. But the story of Virginia has been one of transition from leading, or at least being equal to the United States, to lagging behind the United States in terms of economic activity. And if we look at the two indexes here and set the level of GDP equal to 100 in 2006, you can see Virginia and the United States essentially weather the Great Recession in roughly similar fashion. In 2012, the economies are roughly the same size, but then the U.S. economy starts to accelerate ahead of that of Virginia. And this has been one of the perplexing policy problems for individuals and policymakers in Virginia, is that Virginia has an abundance of natural resources, institutions of higher education, and innovative set of companies, is home to many of the world's largest data centers and data traffic, national defense expenditures, etc., and yet hasn't been able to generate the same levels of economic growth as the United States on average, or many of its neighbors to the south. One of the constraints it has been in Virginia is that coming out of the pandemic, we haven't seen the responsiveness of the labor force that we've seen nationally. Remember, nationally, the labor force in the United States has recovered fully to pre-pandemic levels, if not exceeded pre-pandemic levels. In Virginia, not only did the labor force shrink in the face of the pandemic, it continued to shrink through September 2021. And only then have we seen Virginians return to the labor force, but we still do not have the same amount of individuals in the labor force than we did prior to the pandemic. We have seen jobs recover at roughly the same pace, but this means it's just a smaller pool of labor for employers to draw upon when thinking about jobs. Now, this means that the unemployment rate in Virginia is potentially biased downward, because if we think of the unemployment rate and we think about the numerator of the unemployment rate being the civilian labor force, the civilian labor force doesn't count people who are out of the labor force. And so people have left the labor force in Virginia. That means the pool of available labor is lower, which means the unemployment rate is biased downward slightly. And so what has happened on the other side of the equation, that being the household survey? Let's talk about the establishment survey. We've seen employers in Virginia fully recover the amount of jobs that were lost during the pandemic. And so we have a situation in the Commonwealth where the labor force is smaller, but employers have hired all the jobs back and would likely have created even more jobs if there were people to fill them. And we could see that same type of signal in the quits data, where the quits data shows an imbalance between openings and quits. And so there are approximately 292,000 openings, 109,000 job quits in Virginia in November, with another signal of the tightness of labor markets. So a challenge going forward for the Commonwealth is, how do we get people back to active participation in the labor force? And that's a national challenge as well. And there's a variety of reasons for it, not including long COVID, including the opioid epidemic, but also early retirements of baby boomers who took advantage of increases in housing values and the COVID-19 shock and the gain in equities to exit the labor market entirely. One of the things that powers Virginia and the Hampton Roads area in particular is the national security sector with regards to the defense. You may have heard that the most recent defense appropriations bill increased the defense budget well above what President Biden asked. And so we estimate that the base defense budget in the current fiscal year is $797.7 billion. If that just grows at a relatively conservative rate, that suggests the defense budget could top $860 billion by 2027. But remember the specter of inflation. The specter of inflation erodes the purchasing power of the Department of Defense. People cost more, weapons cost more, fuel costs more, etc. And so if we basically took the Defense Department base budget and asked what it would look like under the president's own assumptions with regards to inflation and our assumptions to inflation, a much different picture emerges. So while the nominal defense spending in FY27 is $863 billion in 2020 dollars, under the president's own budget assumptions, that would be the equivalent of $708 billion in real 2020 spending. So 863 in nominal defense spending in FY27 would essentially be equivalent to $708 billion in defense spending in FY20. But if you use slightly higher inflationary rate that's more in line with private sector forecasts of what inflation might look going forward, that's actually $620 billion in spending. And why is that important? Because even under the president's assumption, the defense budget remains relatively flat over the out years. Under our assumptions, which has a mildly more persistent case of inflation and sustained inflation over the out years, you see a real decline in the defense budget. And if defense budgets decline in real terms, that means you have to either cut weapon systems, you cut people, or you do less. And that is going to be the hard discussion going forward, especially as we're seeing how the conflict in Ukraine and other countries are pivoting towards the importance of certain weapon systems versus the other. In other words, the prominence of unmanned systems and how drones can reshape the battlefield. And of course, China being a geopolitical competitor, has invested heavily in anti-ship and aerial denial weapons, which means that spending, $15 to $20 billion on new aircraft carriers that will have to be pushed out of harm's way creates a real problem in terms of opportunity costs for the Navy and other forces. And so this is something we're looking at in the future. If we think about this and then come back to the crux of the problem for Virginia, we can ask, well, what's happening to the civilian labor force in Virginia? So let's dive into the major metro areas in Virginia and in neighboring areas. If we look at some of the most recent data, the civilian labor force is almost 5% smaller in Washington, D.C., 4% smaller in Hampton Roads, and 4% smaller in Richmond. And if this was consistent across the United States, that would be a different story. But if you look at Raleigh, Durham, if you look at Charlotte, Charleston, Raleigh, Jacksonville, the civilian labor force is larger than it was pre-pandemic. So this is a suggestion that there's something unique to Virginia that is constraining people to come back to the labor force. And so we've had more jobs than generated. We've recovered almost all the jobs in Virginia, but still the major metros that form the urban crescent of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads are still on average below pre-pandemic levels. And when you compare their relative to performance to those areas to the south, it's quite worrisome. And so this suggests that Virginia will continue to underperform states like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas in the coming year, because one, our labor force hasn't returned to pre-pandemic levels, let alone expand, and this will constrain the growth in labor markets. In the big picture, we think that China's recovery is going to ease supply chain constraints significantly as the year goes along. So if you're looking for a new car, you might want to wait for a while, because it will take a while for those gains in supply chains in China to work their way through the system. Consensus appears to be emerging for now that the U.S. economy is going to slow dramatically in the second half of the year. My personal forecast that I submitted to the Philadelphia Fed in the most recent one was 0% in the third quarter. There does not seem to be the prospects of a significant recession, but it would not be surprising if we actually contracted in the second half of the year slightly, or did not grow at all versus grew in a manner similar to that of the previous year. So even if economic growth still slows in the United States and in Virginia, we still have, especially in Virginia, constrained labor supply because of the lack of return of individuals to the labor force, which means that yes, economic growth will likely lead to a lower rate of hiring nationally in the Commonwealth, but employers are still going to be constrained in finding the right employees at the right time, just because the labor pool is smaller in Virginia. And of course, we really haven't talked much about the impact of long COVID on the labor force, and of course, early retirements. The unforeseen, the unknown, the extreme wild card risk in all this is Congress. If the House goes off the proverbial rails, then all bets are off. If the House refuses to pass a debt ceiling increase, then what occurred in the Great Recession, especially if a U.S. default is prolonged, will probably seem anemic to the global financial catastrophe that would happen. Remember, the U.S. dollar underlies the global financial system. If the full faith and credit of the United States is threatened in any such way as it was just threatened back in the early 2010s, you saw premiums on U.S. bonds spike. That cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. A real prospect of a debt default or an actual default by the U.S. would spike yields significantly, leading to the U.S. government having no ability to borrow, perhaps. And you could imagine, when faced with that, they would either have to cut expenditures immediately and dramatically, or print money to meet those expenditures, which would then spark a significant bout of inflation, perhaps like Turkey. We won't even mention something like Argentina. In the best case, there are enough rational actors in the House to pass a debt ceiling increase. We see a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, but not much fire, and the U.S. sort of muddles through 2023 and then starts to see increased growth in 2024 as prices moderate in the face of higher interest rates. And for that, I will turn it over to Dr. Cook. Let me change presenter. There we go.
Well, good afternoon. Bob McNabb just gave you a dose of reality with a little bit of castor oil mixed in, perhaps. Let's just for a moment or so get away from reality and talk about TV lawyers. And the slide you see in front of you now contains pictures of people who, for example, on the upper right-hand side there, those are the people from LA Law. Lower left, that's Raymond Burr and Perry Mason. If Perry Mason ever lost a case, I don't remember. For all of these people on the screen there, big offices, they drive expensive cars, they have lots of assistants. This is the cream of the crop in terms of lawyers. Of this entire group of lawyers, though, there's only one real lawyer, and that's Johnny Cochran. That's Johnny Cochran there defending OJ in that rather famous case. So this is kind of the television or popular image of lawyers, and now I'm here to tell you that it really oftentimes isn't that way. And we need to get this screen to move, and we will do that in a moment. There we go. This guy on the left, that's Bob Odenkirk, who was the star in Better Call Saul. Now, if you ever watched that on TV, and it was on for 6 or 7 years, just went off a year or so ago, you know that he was a down-and-out guy who served down-and-out clients and oftentimes had problems. If you look at the middle picture, this is from a small town that I won't mention its exact location, but you'll see in the middle there's a church, and on the right side, you can barely see in that window, it says lawyer. This is a former bar place. This is a tavern, folks, that an attorney has turned into his or her office. And on the far right, you see somebody who is a public defender, an attorney who's defending people who are in jail and can't afford attorneys. And I want to put all this together and say maybe reality, more often than not, is described by this slide rather than the previous one. Let's go immediately to the numbers so you can see what I'm talking about. In this particular slide, I have indexed the income of lawyers and some other occupations at one in the year 2000. And we're moving that to the right to the year 2001. So if you look at that red line, that is the median income, the 50th percentile income of all people in all occupations in the United States. And 1.07 means that their real income went up on average, the median real income, about 7% over that 20 years. But now let's look at that black dotted line. That's lawyers. Lawyers' real incomes went down approximately 8%. So the median lawyer, not the Johnny Cochrans of the world, but the median lawyer's real income was declining. So I'm not saying their incomes didn't go up, but after we deflate these for price increases, their real income, their spendable income actually declined. But let's compare lawyers to some other people on there. If you look at that dotted green line, those are economists. We didn't do too badly, Bob and I and the other economists. Real income's up 12%. If you look at pharmacists, their real incomes have gone down a bit recently, but still up 15%. And if you look at accountants, they're the brown line, their real incomes are up by 3%. So if you compare lawyers to other more or less comparable occupations that educated people might fill, lawyers aren't doing nearly as well as those other folks. One other way to look at this is to say, well, how much money is being spent on lawyers nationally? Now, one measure of this, it's not a perfect measure, but it's an approximation, is how much money is being spent on legal services as a percentage of gross domestic product. You can see that topped out at 1.6% roughly about 2008, and now it's down to 1.3%. So as a proportion of the economy, the total amount of money being spent on legal services going down, which of course is one reason probably why lawyers' incomes have suffered. Immediately when I talk about this to various groups, people say, well, that's because there's an oversupply of lawyers. And maybe so. What does that mean? Well, to an economist, this means in most cases that in this occupation, people's real incomes have declined for an extended period of time. People's real incomes in an occupation. That we would say is prima facie evidence that maybe there's an oversupply. But I say maybe because, truthfully, there are lots of things that determine how many people enter a profession. The work conditions, how much risk there is, and things of that sort. So there are many reasons why people enter and leave occupations, but one reason, of course, is what real incomes are, and real incomes have been declining in law for some period of time. So we need to ask the big why question. And when economists look at an occupation, incomes in an occupation, they always retreat to supply and demand, to economics 101, where we're looking at markets and saying, what's true on the demand side, what's true on the supply side? Well, let's start with the supply side. And one of the things that we notice is that over the last 20 years, the supply of lawyers, or people who say they are lawyers, has expanded more rapidly than the total number of employed people. So we have more lawyers now proportionally than we used to as a percentage of the labor force. They become more numerous in the employment mix. Now, this slide will be a little bit tough to see, but this is another aspect of the supply situation. In order to become a lawyer, except in unusual circumstances, you have to graduate from an ABA accredited law school, which means you have to get into that law school. And now at most law schools, nearly all of them, the LSAT, the law school admission test, is required. Now, if you look at the 1, 2, 3, fourth column there that looks at the total number of first-time LSAT takers, you can see that it maxed out roughly 2009, 2010, declined, but now this last year that we have recorded information for, it went up rather substantially. And that 98,000 is not terribly much lower than where we were back in the sort of roaring days of the first decade of this century. But of particular interest is the difference between men and women. In that first column with numbers in it there, you can see that the mean number, or the actual number of men taking the LSAT exam, has gone down about 25%, from 53,000 something to 40,000 something. But then you go to the next column, women, and you see that's gone up over a period of time. Now, when you put all this together, there are fewer people taking the LSAT exam than there used to be, but it is particularly true then that women are beginning to dominate the people who are taking the LSAT. In fact, this most recent year, 58% of all the people taking the LSAT were women. Now, this particular graph shows that dark blue line, that's the total number of people taking the LSAT, and you can see that it recovered rather sharply in the most recent recorded year. And the reds and greens, those are men and women. And the green are women, and you can see that women now are clearly beginning to dominate who it is that takes the LSAT, which means that over a period of time, women are going to come to dominate numerically the legal profession as well. What does this have to do with the incomes that lawyers earn? Well, if you look at the orange is the median income by states earned by lawyers in the United States. So the median income for an attorney in 2020 was $104,000. And you can see that's down below what was true in 2010, where it was $114,000. Meanwhile, the blue line is tracking the number of people taking the LSAT. You can see there's a relationship there, isn't there? You can see that when incomes go down, not as many people take the LSAT exam. But now incomes are still pretty low, but the number of LSAT takers has gone back up. Let's look at what's true for men and women. Well, I've already given you some hints here about what's happening. That red line is the percentage of women taking the LSAT. The green line is the percentage of men. You can see that's declining rather significantly. All of this leads us to conclude that women are less sensitive to changes in lawyers' incomes than are men. Men seem to be saying more often than women, well, there are other alternatives. I'm not going to consider the law because it is not as lucrative as it used to be. Let's depart from the supply side and talk a little bit about the demand side. What's the demand for lawyers? Now, it used to be, I would hear people say, well, gee, we have so many lawyers because people simply sue at the drop of a hat. They're suing for everything. They get a scratch on their chin and they sue. But I'm here to tell you now that there doesn't seem to be overwhelming evidence now at all that that's true. In fact, somewhat the opposite. Now, some of this decline in the demand for legal services is due to COVID. Because of COVID, there have been more arbitrations, more conferences, fewer court trials. There have been lots of things that are happening that have decreased the demand for lawyers. But if you look at federal district court cases, and the blues are civil cases and the oranges are criminal cases, you can see, especially over the last 10 years or so, in criminal cases, there's been a real decline in cases filed. And over the 20 years, there's been a decline in the number of, or percentage of cases filed for civil cases as well. What this means is, at the federal level anyway, people aren't suing each other as often and taking things to court. Once again, more arbitrations, more counseling, more kinds of things where people have to agree ahead of time that they're not going to sue each other, all of which is among the reasons why the demand for attorneys has declined. Now, what's also true out there is what one attorney friend of mine has called blue-collar law. And by that he meant that it is now the case that large employers of lawyers, like insurance companies and the like, have price schedules that they confront especially younger attorneys with, and they say, we'll pay you $3,000 for this case, but that's all you get, without getting special approval from us. What they're doing, you see, is saying, this is what we're going to pay and no more. And in the language of an economist, they have monopsony power. They have powers as buyers. Well, many large corporations now are doing the same thing when they bid out legal services, and they're saying, we'll pay you this, or we'll pay you a certain amount per hour and no more. So this has forced a lot of, especially beginning lawyers and people in small firms, to accept lower stipends and essentially not to compete on a price range. Now, amidst all of this, there's the problem of automation. Is it possible that one can substitute, in the language of an economist, capital for labor? That you can use things like software and chat to substitute for attorneys? Well, this particular graph I'm showing you here comes from the United Nations. And if you look at the occupations on the left-hand side, you put lawyers somewhere maybe 2/3 of the way down the bottom in terms of where they might stand in terms of the risk of automation. So it's not overwhelming, but it's still the case for lawyers that one can use things like LexisNexis to do the work that beginning attorneys used to do. One can use legal assistants and the like, and chat to do things that don't require lots of judgment. Now, software, typically, even chat, is still not very good at more sophisticated kinds of things that involve intuition or taste and smell and the like. But I'm here to tell you that artificial intelligence is getting better and better at these things. I see this in the examinations that I give my students. They're turning in things that are clearly from chat, even though they don't say that. But one can detect those kinds of things. Can chat do some legal work in the future? I think the answer is yes, and that will continue the decline in demand for attorneys. Now, amidst all this, another article that I have that's going to be published shortly connects all of this excess of lawyers, if there is one, to a decline in economic growth rates. In simple terminology, having too many lawyers increases costs and reduces economic growth rates. Too many lawyers, that has a depressing effect on society's economic growth. What does all this add up to? Well, here's Better Call Saul again, and he's standing in front of a place that used to be his legal office. His legal office was in the back of this place in a little room that he was renting. And inside here, they were doing hairdos and people were having their nails done and so forth. And eventually he got evicted even out of that office because he couldn't pay his fees. I'm here to say now that this particular example may be more representative of the situation for increasing number of lawyers than many lawyers would like to admit. This has been a tough time for lawyers over the last 10 or 20 years, and it bodes probably to be the same in the future. You're probably wondering where all these numbers came from. Here they are. You're going to get a copy of these slides. You can check all these numbers if you like. And that is all I have to say about this topic of lawyers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. McNabb, Dr. Cook, for those very different but both very interesting presentations. So for our audience, we do have about 5 minutes left in the hour. I'm not seeing any questions so far, but please, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the questions box, and we'll be happy to get to them in the next few minutes here. And if there are any that we can't get to before we leave, we'd be happy to follow up as appropriate. I'll give it a minute here for folks to type in their questions. Maybe I'll just take moderator's privilege just out of curiosity. Where did the investigation into lawyers' salaries, where did that originate? I'm curious.
It originated from my work on the State of the Region and State of the Commonwealth reports for the center that Dr. McNabb runs. We're always looking at the salaries that people are earning, and I happened to take a peek at lawyers' salaries and said, these are going down. How can that be? Well, I then began to do some investigation and was fortunate enough to get data from the Bar Association and the like, and was able to document that, yes, these have been reasonably tough times, but it came from the kinds of things that the Draga Center does on an ongoing basis.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thank you. It's certainly interesting to see. And it looks like we do have some questions coming in. So I'll turn to some audience questions for the last few minutes here. One participant asks, any insight into the housing market in the Tidewater area for the year?
Sure. We're, regardless of what adherents to modern monetary theory might have argued, we're seeing that interest rate policy does matter. And what we're seeing is two factors. First, not unexpectedly, as interest rates increase, housing demand is softening somewhat. But that has to be counterbalanced with the fact that the supply of single-family housing and multifamily housing remains relatively constrained because we just haven't been building like we did prior to the Great Recession. So if you look at building permits prior to the Great Recession, and then you look at the building permits after the Great Recession, and even after housing prices started to ramp up considerably in the United States, we haven't seen the impulse of response that one might say from developers in terms of creating more single-family housing supply. And more importantly, the type of housing supply that's being created is much more on the upscale end versus the downscale end. In other words, if you're wanting to go out and find a new 1,100 square foot home, you're not going to find it. That's not what developers are building anymore. They're building much higher scale properties. So for the Tidewater area, Richmond, and even Northern Virginia, we're going to see retrenchment in the market. That is, we're going to see prices soften, days on the market increase. But if you're expecting a return to 2010, when there's several thousand foreclosed listings in the market, and there's even greater foreclosed listings in terms of supply, that's not likely to be what is going to happen in the short term, unless, of course, Congress totally drops the ball. Then nobody's worrying about buying a house anymore.
Quite ominous, but understandable. Maybe I'll end with this question. There are some others, but just to make sure that we end roughly on time. I have a question. How much of Virginia's lagging growth relative to the U.S. Could be attributable to kind of a relative lack of diversification of the economy? This person cites, dependence on government spending, for example.
Yeah, Virginia is more dependent relative to the neighbors that are outperforming it on federal government spending than, for example, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, etc. That dependency is a blessing and a curse. It stabilizes the economy, one might argue, in downturns, but it also may limit the ability of the economy to grow faster because of crowding out. And so if we're discussing this, as a matter of fact, for a topic in this year's SOR, that Virginia, with a higher proportion of veterans and a higher proportion of military retirees than many other states, does that lead to lower rates of innovation, lower rates of labor force participation? Because if you are receiving a retirement pension or disability pension from the VA, the financial pressure to go out in the labor market and participate in the labor market and command a higher salary is less than if you're not receiving that source of income. And so part of the discussion in Richmond has been, how do we diversify the economy over time? And you're seeing diversification occur in Richmond. You're seeing it at a greater extent in Northern Virginia. And some of the smaller metro areas are actually leading Virginia, Blacksburg, Winchester in terms of economic growth. The larger problem is in Hampton Roads, the Department of Defense spending directly and indirectly accounts for approximately 40% of regional gross domestic product. It's really hard to move that needle in the short term, but now at least there's a concerted awareness here, in part thanks to the efforts of Dr. Cook for 2 decades telling people you need to diversify the economy, to move into renewable energy, health sciences services, unmanned systems, and the like, while still remaining a distinctive part of U.S. national security.
Great. Well, thank you. We do have, like I said, a few more questions. We'll be happy to follow up after the webinar, and I'll let our coordinator, Brian, speak to that. I wanted to personally thank Drs. McNabb and Cook for their great presentations once again. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you at future REMI webinars.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah, thank you to all who attended. Again, thank you to Bob and James for the great presentation. In about an hour, the slides from this presentation, the recording, and the report itself will be emailed to everybody who registered, so keep your eyes out for that. Like Peter said, we didn't get to quite all the questions, but I'll make sure to hand it over to Bob and James, and they can reach out as they're able to. If you have any questions about this webinar as well, you can reach out to info@remi.com, the email box, and we'll direct you to the resources that you need. And again, yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Have a great day.